In the last few videos, we've spent our time on discussion boards, and it's worth pausing to recognize what a discussion board actually is. At its best, it's a kind of whole class group work. Everyone is contributing to a shared intellectual project, building on each other, responding, revising their thinking in public. When it works, it's the closest an asynchronous course comes to the feel of a lively seminar. But there's a ceiling to what a whole class discussion can do. The accountability is diffuse. If one student doesn't show up, the conversation absorbs it. No single person's silence breaks the activity. That diffuseness is a strength for participation, but it's also a limit. Some of the deepest learning happens when students have to genuinely depend on one another, when the work can't get done unless 3 or 4 people coordinate, negotiate, and produce something together. So I want to pivot from the whole class conversation to the small group. The project team, the collaborative assignment, the 3 or 4 students who have to make something together. And I want to be honest with you up front. This is one of the hardest things to do well in an asynchronous course. Here's the core tension. We teach asynchronously for a reason. Many of our students have significant responsibilities away from campus. They have jobs, families, commutes, caregiving. The whole promise of asynchronous learning is that they can engage on their own schedule at 6 in the morning or at midnight. That flexibility is the feature. Group work runs directly against that feature. The moment you ask 4 students to produce something together, you're asking them to find overlap in their schedules, in their availability, possibly across time zones. The very flexibility that made the course possible for them now becomes the obstacle. And then there's our side of it. In a face-to-face class, you can read a group at a glance. You walk the room, you see who's learning and who's checked out. You catch the tension before it becomes a problem. Asynchronously, that work happens in spaces you may never see, on timelines you're not watching. Uneven participation doesn't announce itself. It festers quietly, and very often you don't learn about it until the project is due and 3 exhausted students are emailing you about the 4th who vanished back in week 2. Because inevitably there's a 4th. Every instructor who assigns group work eventually meets the student who, to borrow from Herman Melville, would prefer not to. I don't say that cynically. People disappear from our classes for real and serious reasons. But whatever the cause, one disengaged member can capsize a team and drag down the grades of everyone who did show up. Our job is to build the structure that keeps that from happening. The single most effective thing you can do is front-load the structure before any real work begins. One of the best tools for this is the group charter, sometimes called a team working agreement. The idea is simple. In the first week of the project, before students write a word of the actual assignment, each group produces a short agreement that governs how they'll work together. You give them the template, they fill it in. It asks them to decide, as a group, a few things that teams usually leave dangerously implicit. First, their communication norms. Where will this group actually live? The Brightspace group space, a Slack channel, a Discord server, email? And what's the expected response time? 24 hours, 48 hours? Naming that number out loud changes everything because now silence has a definition. Second, the division of labor. Who is responsible for what and by when? Not a vague promise to, quote, split it evenly, but an actual map of ownership. And third, the one that matters most, what I'd call the missed deadline protocol. The group decides together in advance what happens when someone misses an internal deadline or goes quiet. They write that clause themselves while everyone is still cooperative and optimistic, long before anyone is actually frustrated. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not handing you a step-by-step recipe because the real value of the charter isn't the form, it's what the form does. It makes the implicit explicit. It gives students authorship over their own accountability. They set the rules, so the rules are theirs, not just yours. And it gives you a document to point back to. When a conflict arises, you're no longer the referee inventing a ruling on the spot. You're a facilitator reminding a group of the agreement they made. It moves you out of the middle. And as a bonus, this is exactly how functional teams operate in the professional world your students are heading into. So the charter itself is teaching a transferable skill. The charter handles the student's side of the equation, but you need a plan of your own. And that's the second thing I'd encourage you to build before the project ever launches: a personal intervention checklist. Think of it as deciding your moves in advance while you're calm and fair-minded, rather than in the heat of a conflict 3 days before the deadline. 2 pieces are worth thinking through. The first is the nudge. Decide ahead of time what triggers your intervention. Maybe it's a student who hasn't logged into the group space in 4 days. Whatever the threshold, define it, and then decide what that first message says. A low-stakes, non-accusatory check-in that opens a door rather than levels an accusation. When you've drafted it in advance, you intervene consistently and early instead of reactively and late. The second is the restructure. This is the hard one. If a student drops the course or disappears entirely, what happens to the people left behind? Decide now how you'll adjust the workload or the grading so the remaining members aren't punished for someone else's absence. Students will forgive a great deal if they trust that you won't let them sink for a teammate's failure. And knowing your restructure plan in advance lets you offer that reassurance the moment it's needed. So here's where I'll leave it. Effective group work in an asynchronous course isn't about recreating the synchronous classroom. You can't, and trying will only frustrate everyone. It's about building scaffolding strong enough that if the interdependence becomes survivable and even valuable. The group charter gives your students a shared structure and ownership of their own accountability. Your intervention checklist gives you the readiness to step in early and fairly when something goes wrong. Put those 2 halves together, and you've turned the riskiest assignment in your course into one of the most genuinely collaborative things your students will do all term.